Today, I want to welcome a very good friend of mine and my go-to restaurant real estate guru, Emily Durham. Emily, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. So nice to see you this morning.
For a complete disclosure, I want people to know that Emily is particularly knowledgeable of real estate for restaurants because she knows this industry inside and out, from culinary and from operations, from managing. And for a number of years, we consulted together on projects before she got into real estate full time. And so that's the reason why, not just for today, but as you go forward and you've got clients that have issues, or you've got people coming to you and they want to expand and start growing, if there's any question about how to find, where to find, and how much to pay, I would tell you to reach out to Emily Durham. Emily, why don't you take a couple minutes and maybe tell the folks about your position, your recent move, your specialty in hospitality, and then we'll just go from there.
Absolutely. Thank you. Like you said, my entire career has been in the restaurant industry, whether that was in operations on the culinary side or on the management team, or in the back office, doing accounting, or you name it. We've done it in the restaurant industry. And after doing consulting with you, Chris, for several years, I really enjoyed the process of helping people open their restaurants. And so I became a real estate broker, really exclusively just for the restaurant industry. And that's what I do now. For the last 7 or 8 years, I was a partner at a boutique firm in Houston called Waterman Steele Real Estate Advisors. And I've just moved over about 2 months ago to a global platform at JLL, Jones Lang LaSalle, where I continue to just solely focus on restaurant real estate here in Texas and Houston and literally throughout the country and the world as a master broker for some chains rolling out everywhere. So what the hope was that we approach the real estate process with at least some knowledge of what people are going through, some knowledge of their operations, and what needs to get in place successfully to make a location work. So love what I do every single day. We help people that are large, small, franchised, independents, you name it. Anyone?
Well, see, that's the first thing that I want to underline for those who are listening, is that when you're wanting to open your restaurant, and whether it's the very first one or whether you've done it before, it's always best to make sure that you utilize services of people who just don't understand that particular industry, but specialize in restaurants. So you'll always hear me recommend that. If we were talking about accounting today, I would tell you to please find people who don't just understand accounting, but understand restaurants and specialize in restaurant accounting. So most of the people that are going to be listening to this are in the Dallas area or north of Dallas or communities around the Dallas region. So that's the second thing that I want to underline, is that the principles Emily is going to talk about today work throughout the state. In fact, she and her group work throughout the nation. So just because this may be a Houston-based person, things about trends, rents, negotiations, and the process of finding a location isn't restricted to that city. These are principles that you're going to want to abide by, regardless of where you are in the state.
Absolutely. And we have offices all over the world. So when we're working in Dallas or San Antonio or any Texas market, it's going to be a combination of me on my team heading up the project with local brokers in whatever trade area we're in. But you really can't emphasize enough the importance of making sure your team is comprised of restaurant specialists. And, when you get to locations, that's the architect, that's the general contractor, and that's the attorney that's reviewing your lease. It makes a huge difference.
Excellent point. Well, quick reminder, use the chat room, anybody. If there's a particular issue you want to make sure we spend some time on, or if you have a question about something Emily is bringing up, type in a question. We'll make sure we get to it before we let you go at 11. But what we want to do is just start with the whole process. I'm just going to be throwing some issues and questions at Emily, and she's going to kind of walk us through how we can best find our locations and survive the process and well, not just survive, but succeed through this process. So maybe we should just kind of start, Emily, if you give us an overview of the market, the statewide market, post-COVID. We've heard, again, all kinds of stories about, are there restaurant closures? Is it easier now? Is it harder now? What's going on with the markets? What are landlords looking for? So if you could give us a little overview of the market from a restaurant tenant perspective, that'd be, I think, the best first step.
Sure, happy to. I think that most people thought that with the pandemic, one of the after effects would be lots and lots of second generation restaurant spaces that are available because people failed. And quite honestly, I don't think I've ever seen a tighter market where there's less inventory available in my career.
Wow.
So I think that people, opportunistic groups that had resources, took a lot of the spaces that were falling out. But just in Texas in general, we really didn't skip as many beats as other parts of the country did. Our governments made it pretty business friendly for the most part to stay open, or to stay open to some extent, or to expand a patio. So Texas stayed very, very strong on the operations side of being open, way, way different than what we saw on either of the coasts. So we didn't have as many closures as probably people would have thought, or as they've had in other markets. So, and the first thing that happened for almost anybody when the pandemic hit was, of course, business slowed down, and there were challenges to everybody's operations. So we had to go back to all of our landlords and ask for rent concessions and for help. So I feel like for at least 6 months, everything kind of stopped and refocused to really efforts on renegotiating terms and asking for assistance in getting through this time. So some landlords were amenable, some were not. It really just depends on the landlord and who the tenant was, certainly. So I would say there's not a glut of second generation restaurant spaces, even though that's really everybody's preference to find, of course, because usually, not always, usually it's easier to build out your restaurant space. So it remains a very competitive market. And that's why I love to see when our clients work with teams like yours, Chris, at a la carte, to be as prepared as they possibly can be, because it is very competitive out there.
Okay, and that's going to help, I think, if we go right into that. That's probably right there. That information is probably a surprise to some, because we know that Texas, thankfully, is a very, very strong market. But you're right. I think many, many people felt like the pandemic created opportunities that were otherwise maybe not out there. We read a lot of those national headlines about retail market in a slump and the amount of people having to give up, and the amount of people not returning from home-based work to office work, and that was just the downfall of restaurants, and they're going to board up their windows. And as you said, that's not necessarily the case. And so we're going to have to be careful when we go out there and start looking for locations, that the market is tight and it's competitive, and we have to be prepared. So could I get you to go through a little bit of that? Because I know that prepared to find a site, especially for the person who's excited, they got their money, maybe they took early retirement, they've never been in the restaurant business, but they're all excited because they've got money and they've got an idea. So sometimes they just run on out there and want to find a location that I guess is close to their home or excites them. But what is it that they should do? What's the process the way you see it?
Well, first and foremost, not just because I am one, but it's very important to try and use a broker. We are only paid by the landlords, so why not employ a real estate expert to help with the process? And I really find that it lends credibility to the process as well, certainly when it's a startup group. If there's an established real estate broker helping them and talking to landlords they may already have a relationship with, it just helps. So that's number one. Get a broker who does restaurants. just like the architect and the attorney and the general contractor.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I think, if you're an operator out there, remember, if you're driving the neighborhoods yourself, well, then you're not necessarily getting the real market condition reports that a broker can give you. If you see something that excites you, calling the name that's stuck on the window isn't what you want to do. That person isn't working for you. That person's working for the landlord. What you want to do is make a note maybe of what it is you're interested in, see a broker and run it by them.
100%. Unfortunately, when people drive around and call those numbers, there's a lot of times they just don't get a call back. So save the time, collect the things that look interesting to you, talk to a broker. Sometimes those things really aren't available. Sometimes we already know that it cannot be a restaurant. And in addition, one of the best things about working with real estate people is when we know things that aren't on the market, where there is no sign in the window. So make a real estate broker part of your team and discuss the market and what's going on, and ask them what they know about what's happening. Plus, JLL, where I am, and a lot of the other firms, we have tremendous analytics now. So, someone like me or our team that specializes in restaurants, we can really just sit down and talk about a market, who's buying what they're, when they're going, and kind of really use data to our advantage in making some site selections versus just kind of looking at what's available sometimes, although it's tempting, and sometimes it works perfectly.
So then the second thing, okay, so let's say everyone says, you know what, you're right. I'm going to use a broker. I'm going to check them out. They specialize in restaurants. Yay. So the second step, what is it you need from them to do your job well?
So the first thing, that this is a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, unfortunately, but the first thing a landlord wants to know is who you are, what your background is, if you own other restaurants, and what your financial position looks like. That is critical to this process. Now, that, that scales up and down depending on where the site is. If it's a neighborhood site in an older building that's not, 100,000 cars a day where, all the national tenants want to be, that's one thing. And of course, it goes to the other extreme if it is that kind of scenario. But we realize that we need leases a lot of times to get our SBA funding. Mm-hmm. However, we still have to present a personal financial statement. We give templates to our clients to fill out. And we want to see a concept description at the very least, a menu. If you're not a franchise that already has those things established and you're starting a new concept, you got to put some information together. And, whether that's a consulting team or the Small Business Development Center, or whoever you're able to work with, this is mandatory. Just calling somebody and saying it's a startup, they've never had a restaurant before and they want to do Italian food, we got to take it one step further, in my opinion, and present bios. Even if you didn't own a restaurant before, you've done something that makes you a savvy business person, or whatever the case may be. You have qualifications, and it's depending on who the landlord is, it really is personal. So we have to start introducing ourselves properly. And again, the financials are critical.
That makes great sense.
Yeah, the landlord needs to
insert a quick plug there that for operators that hear this, that what that's telling you is, maybe success for a restaurant really is location, as with many other businesses. But from what Emily has just presented, it doesn't start with go get the location first. It starts with getting your idea prepared, putting your personal information together, having a little bit of a concept, a plan, a menu, sitting with your advisor at the SBDC or some other person who's going to help you with budgets, opening costs, and projections. So you really have a grasp of what you're getting into. Then you can give the broker what he or she needs to best represent you. There's probably some advisors that are hearing this that are giggling because you've heard it the other way, where people are running in, all excited. I found a location. Right. I'm so excited. He sent me over the lease. Now I have to put together my idea and I have to put it on paper, and I don't know what this is going to cost me. And it's got to work the other way, or you're going to be, I think, wasting a lot of time is what I'm hearing from Emily.
Yeah, and it's just not in anyone's best interest to do it that way. I mean, you need to think through your concept, think through or find help in working through what it's going to cost more or less to open it, how much revenue you think you can hit. And then we work backwards to say, based on all of that, here's a rent level we can likely support. And if it doesn't meet that back of the envelope test, we shouldn't be looking at it. It shouldn't be something that costs so much more than, sort of our average occupancy percentage we want to see. That's just starting with an uphill battle ahead of you. So yeah, the preparation early, especially pre-opening planning, is critical. And then just, on the topic of those financials, what's happening is every landlord, unfortunately, almost every landlord, wants tenants to personally guarantee a lease. And what they're looking for is us to guarantee the value of the primary term of the lease. I mean, that could be $1 million. Most people don't have $1 million sitting in the bank. So we negotiate that point, but they want to see that you can pay the rent should something go wrong, and they will hold you liable for that. Although we can talk about that after. There's some modifications to what actually happens in real life. And they want to know what you're going to spend on build out. How much is it going to cost you to do this? And do you have that much money? Where are you getting it from? So the more, it's also going through this iterative process ahead of time is doesn't help anybody more than the operator herself in deciding what makes sense and doesn't.
Sounds good. So now we're at the point where we can begin to search, but I like the way you presented that. You can begin to look for places that you know are going to fit the particular concept, because there's been a brief concept, there's bios, there's menus written, and it fits the rent structure, because there's no need to spend time in neighborhoods if you know that somebody's developed a concept that has realistic financials, but those realistic financials aren't going to support the rent that
Right.
that market area is demanding.
Right.
Okay, so now through the search, why don't you walk people through then? Let's kind of move it along. The broker has found a place. What's the work that gets done then? Because I think there's some confusion that goes back to your earlier point, where you're not really going to get a loan funded without having a location. But you're also not going to get a location unless you can show them that you're funded.
Yeah, it's crazy. It really
So,
is.
yeah, how do you go through letter of intent from the bank, commitment letter from a landlord, to then turn it into, I guess, well-negotiated lease when you're ready?
Yeah, so the first part of the process is, like you said, a letter of intent, which is a proposal for the business terms of the deal. And that can come from the tenant side or it can come from the landlord side. And when I say business terms, those are things like the rental rate, the amount of time you have until you have to start paying rent, parking stipulations. There's several things involved in that. And once that is submitted, the very next thing that'll happen is the request for financials. And I would say too that one of the biggest components to working out a lease deal is the amount of tenant improvement money that the landlord will give us. And so the showing our financials directly impacts how much tenant improvement monies the landlord will provide to us. If we are, they call it credit worthy, meaning we have money in the bank, that will dictate the terms, a lot of the business terms of the deal. So they're looking for the least risk as they can find. And if it doesn't feel like it's low risk, then it will affect the amount of money we receive as a contribution from the landlord to do the build out. So we go back and forth for a while, it could be a long while, on the business terms of the lease. If you don't have somebody assisting you in that process, you're going to leave a lot on the table, and you're going to get to a lease, and leases can be confusing. And then there are going to be things that are just really not in your favor that have to do with business terms that you might not even catch. So it's best to take this first step of negotiating the letter of intent. Now, to your question about the financials, We love it when we can get a pre-approval letter from a bank, along with some money in the bank that's set aside for the build out of the project. And um, and then as soon as there's a lease underway, from a general contractor to take to the bank to finalize out of the loans for important. So one of the first things we do when we're looking at sites to kind of decide, see how much work to do, is get a general contractor in there early or an architect to help think through. I think a lot of people assume that, you have like that. We need a great amount of detail to get an exact bid on how much the project's going to cost. So if it's a second generation space, that's easier.
Right.
But we know what we're doing to the space. And we have to know what type of flooring we want to use to some extent, what type of counter we want to put in to some extent. Otherwise, the numbers are completely arbitrary, really. And,
Right.
and that the most important part of that is that we start with finding out if the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing components of the space are usable, are workable, need improvements, don't need improvements. And that all moves the dial a lot on our pre-opening costs.
So I'm not sure if, operators really realize that the amount of work in addition to just a letter of intent and sort of a statement of terms, and then in addition to, getting the bank process started, having some type of pre-qualification letter. I'm just not so sure people understand that in order to properly negotiate for tenant improvement dollars, the more prepared we are on what kind of finishes, what kind of materials, how much we think they're going to cost. That means that design should have had a role, at least some preliminary layout work. It also means that that's when we want to bring a contractor in, as you've mentioned, to walk through the location. So these are things that are very, very important to finding your lease and getting the deal done correctly. But I don't think many operators realize that or prepared for that part.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, along those lines within that process too, is just because something already has a kitchen in it, we need to make sure it's a kitchen that works for your concept. So your menu and your concept dictate the kitchen equipment you need. So there's also that part of the process where, can we work with the equipment that's there? Does the equipment that's in, say we're getting a second generation space, does the equipment that's in place work well? We need inspections done before any leases are signed. And then what other equipment will we need to put in place? And then from there, with the equipment we know we need, let's say we have to buy it all new, there's so much that goes along with it. The equipment has, it has electricity components and requirements related to it, as well as exhaust and, myriad of other things. So there's definitely, if you don't want to end up with surprises that could really hurt, especially now, everything's a little bit more expensive. Supply chain is taking a long time. Then the more homework we can do ahead of time, the better.
Great advice. Okay, so we're going through the process, letter of intent. If we find through this process that our excitement is waning because there are problems that we discovered or the cost estimates are higher than we think we can fund, is this letter of intent binding? Have we just wasted our time, or are we now obligated for anything more?
No, letter of intent is not legally binding. And my advice also to people is, landlords don't love it, but maybe sometimes we put contingencies in that letter of intent, such that we say, I agree to all of these business terms so long as I'm able to get a building permit, so long as the inspections tell us that this equipment works, something. So it is not legally binding. The only thing that's legally binding is when you sign a lease. However, when we've agreed to the business terms in a letter of intent, it's just standard practice not to change those later. They call
Okay.
in the industry trading. We've agreed to things. The landlord doesn't want to see us come back mid-lease and say, we really want to pay less rent. So it's important to work through all that as far as we can and with as much confidence as we can in the beginning.
Good, great points. You were cutting out a tiny bit, so I just want to repeat that you brought up the fact that although the letter of intent is not binding, it's wise to see if you can, and you try to do, specific contingencies to call out those important items like being contingent upon being able to get a building permit, or contingent upon the items that are represented as working are in fact working. That makes sense. And I think the other point you were saying that also makes sense is just because it's not binding, we shouldn't be leaving important things out, because when we do get to the lease, the basic business principles in principle shouldn't change from letter of intent to the lease, because if they do, that's normally a problem. And obviously, we're trying to be prepared to go through this process with little, or as few problems as possible.
Right.
So when we get into the lease, can you describe people what a typical restaurant lease is looking like in Texas now? Are they 5 years? Are they usually 10 years? Can you normally get options as a part of a lease, or are extra options sort of an additional item?
So most leases are either 5 years or 10 years. If we are talking about franchises, we want the term of the lease, and sometimes it's required to match the length of your franchise agreement. So that's important. So usually 5 or 10 years. We always want to ask for options just for that reason. So we have the option of continuing. And we will negotiate the rent in the primary term of the 5 or the 10 years. And we really want to have a set rent for the option terms as well, just so we know what's coming. And sometimes we're able to do that, and sometimes we're not. So usually 5 to 10 years, maybe in a smaller project, that we can maybe do a 3-year lease sometimes. A lot of what this decision comes down to is how much money we're going to spend. If you're going to spend $2 million, then you should be thinking about locking into a lease that's longer rather than shorter, so that you have enough time to earn the money back that you spent to build it out.
And what are you normally finding with, say, restaurants that do this successfully? What are you normally finding that they're looking at for how many years into the lease it should be before they got their initial investment out?
It really depends. It really depends. It could be 2 years to anything.
Okay.
So that's probably a better question for whomever you're working with on revenue modeling to figure out how that's going to go.
Because because I would definitely agree with you that it is going to vary. There is no magic number, but I would say if you can make an investment into a restaurant and know that you have realistic pre-tax profit that you can pull to pay yourself back and get that money back in 2 to 3 years, that's wonderful, because it usually might take longer, 4, 5, or 6. Many times people are signing a 10-year lease, and the first 50%, the first half of that lease is spent getting their money back and paying off their debt. And, then they're very happy. Then the second half of the lease is where they are actually able to keep money and distribute funds and that kind of thing. So there's no need to go into this with unrealistic expectations.
Absolutely.
I know you touched on this earlier, but now we're at the point to go into it in detail, I guess, with the lease. As you mentioned, it's 5 to 10 years. Usually you like to lock in the option periods. I think for listeners, it is very important. It depends on the size and the investment you're making. If this is maybe a very small counter service restaurant that requires very little investment and you're just wanting 3 or 4 years, maybe you get a smaller lease. But most of you who are listening are probably thinking of doing, a full service restaurant, and you're going to be investing a significant amount of time and money. So you probably want a 10-year option, a 10-year lease. and have a couple of 5-year options available if you can get them firmed up. So Emily, then what happens when they come back and agree to some of the rental terms? There's 2 things that I think we need to spend some time on. And one is a personal guarantee negotiable? And if so, how do you handle that? What is the strength they're looking at that might negotiate less time for your client to be personally guaranteeing all of this?
Well, unfortunately, for a lot of folks that are just entering the business, one of the most important variables here is whether or not you've owned restaurants before. If you're a first operator, that leaves a landlord feeling a little less certain about the guaranteed success of the project. And the less experience the operator has in general, the longer they're going to look for the guarantee. The more locations you have, the more we can negotiate the guarantee. But first location, first time operator will be the hardest to negotiate down on that guarantee. Now, there's options around, sometimes people say if you happen to, if you are well funded already, sometimes people offer things like a year's rent ahead of time as, a way to minimize that guarantee somewhat. But other than that, it's just the number of locations under your belt and experience you have, and again, the perceived risk by the landlord.
Well said. Good to know. So, if we're working with brand new startups, we need to know what we're looking at. And for you operators out there that are in the process of opening for the first time, see, this is what you're going to need to be looking at. Let's hit some other truths of the system that you could maybe lay out for us, like about what should we be thinking in Texas as far as a percentage of sales to budget for rent? And then maybe you could go into what are the other costs that operators are paying. So it isn't just rent, there's other costs. And a lot of times people are caught by surprise because we don't understand.
Yeah, let's talk about that first. So retail leases are usually what we call triple net leases. So there's a base rent component, which is some number multiplied by the square foot of your space. And then the triple nets, also called operating expenses, are the pass-through expenses from the landlord of insurance, taxes, and property insurance. For the most part, those triple net expenses are non-negotiable. It's, again, a direct pass-through from the landlord. And, the one part of it that is, especially in bigger centers, is the common area maintenance. And what we try and do there is put a cap on how much it can go up every year. But the property taxes and the insurance are pass-throughs. So we're really only negotiating the base rent component of the deal, if that makes sense. Usually it's quoted in a number per square foot per year. And
I know that varies. I mean, depending on what community you're in Texas, yeah, there might be $20 to $25 per square foot in rent. You might be at $50 or $60 per square foot for rent. Am I in the right range?
Yeah, $20, $25, maybe even sub 20 in smaller markets, very small markets outside of an urban core. In Houston, for example, I don't think that exists anywhere. So we're even seeing $30 and $40 base rent out in suburbs. And there's a reason for that. Lots of people have moved, are working from home in those suburbs. But yeah, like the inside of the loop in Houston or in Dallas, places like Plano, we could be easily at $85 base rent before the expenses, which sometimes are another $30. So that's $110 per square foot in rent. And we typically want the rent we're paying to fall somewhere around 6 to 8% of our top line revenue. So when we're looking at any deal, that's the first calculation we do is, okay, this is what they're asking. What is the implied revenue we must do to keep this number at 6 to 8% of our expenses?
Very important for operators to hear. That's how you know if you're going to be able to fit into a market. If you're happy with your menu and your per person expenditure, and if you have people assist you with your revenue projections, so you think your table turns are reasonable and you're coming up with an annual revenue that you think is believable, then immediately look at what 6 to 8% of that is. And as Emily has outlined, that's your target. So you want to look for places that you feel your concept's going to work, your customer profile is going to work, but that under reasonable revenue expectations, 6 to 8% of that's going to cover the rent.
This is critical, 100%. We start, and that's how we start a lot of conversations is, let's say it's a chain of restaurants. What's your average unit volume? And therefore, let's agree on a rental range that works in your business model. We don't want to start out with rent that's so high, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, that's a good point. And if a multi-unit already in the business successful group is abiding by this principle, then you brand new to the industry startups that are listening, please underline that, because we don't want you to get so overloaded with interest or passion and I just can't let this site go. Maybe I'll be busier. Maybe it's okay if my rent's at 11% instead of the 8. I'll find something else to kind of trim. And then bingo, you sign a lease and you've guaranteed it. And now your profit margin, which is tight in this industry anyway, has been drastically cut. And see, a good industry broker doesn't want to get you in a situation like that. They don't want to write up a deal to see you fail. So they're going to want to take you to a place or help you find places. They're going to keep you in that 6 to 8% range. Don't go jumping up and down saying, yeah, but I got to be over there because I don't know, for whatever reason. I've heard them all. I got to be closer to the cinema. I got to be out front. I got to be on the corner. So I'll just find a way of paying it. Ouch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so those are very important things: how the rent works, how the lease works, how the terms work, what those pass-through triple nets mean. Another item that I think sometimes is misunderstood is, what is a good rent start date? And isn't that something that's always written in the lease?
We like to and insist on negotiating the rent commencement date in the LOI.
Okay.
So this is the date on which you need to start paying rent. And we know how long permits can take anywhere. So what we try and do, the best case scenario is that we will have negotiated a rent commencement date that is tied to your receipt of permits, not tied to your signing of the lease. We're not always successful in getting that, but this is an important number and we do not want to pay dark rent. So, and that means pay rent before we're open. So let's say the landlord will not agree to tie the rent commencement to permits because they can't control that either. We need to make sure we believe we have ample time to get our drawings done if we need an architect and get a permit, find out how long permits are taking in your municipality, and then how long our build out is going to take. So this is also something that happens to people when they're not represented is, if a landlord says you just start paying rent 90 days after you sign your lease, it's just not going to work. And then so you're starting in negative position. Yeah,
that's very, very true. So I hope that is something that you people are making note of, because that can really hurt. Yes, sometimes people have to budget paying rent during construction. Mm-hmm. If it's all part of the negotiation, but you want to keep that to a minimum. And right now, that's really hard to figure because of construction delays and because of permit, log jams. So that's a very important item. And again, a broker who understands the industry and has done this a lot is going to help you negotiate that the best way you can.
There's also a lot of things that can happen to this conversation we just had. If somebody is vacating their restaurant space and they're trying to sublease it it's a whole different ballgame. You know, if we're trying to take over somebody's lease, then we don't have as much latitude in negotiating some of these terms. So there's a lot of things that affect the deal. And sometimes if, we know somebody's leaving their lease and we want their space and it's a great second gen space, we are going to pay rent sooner. And it makes sense in those cases.
Let's visit that issue that you just brought up, if you could, because you could probably talk about both sides of that. Because if we've gone through this process now from properly preparation, finding the right site, we got the bank on board, we went from letter of intent, we did the lease, we brought in the attorney to do the legal review of the lease. Yay! So the good news is now I'm open. But after I'm open, how do I operate with a couple of things like the right to sell if I want to? Are there restrictions in the lease that maybe I need to be aware of? Because sometimes an operator does that. They're in their third or fourth year. Maybe the business is going good, maybe it isn't, but they have an opportunity to sell. Walk us through that.
Yeah, and again, that's another component that we put in our LOIs. We want to get this out of the way early, that we have some rights to assign the lease or to sublease the space. And there's semantics involved in this, which is legal language that's very common. And one means the landlord can say no for any reason. And another way of saying it means they can't, they have to be reasonable. So this is super important, especially again, if we're a franchise, we also usually have guidelines provided by the franchisor that have to go in the lease regarding their ability to take a space from a failed franchise. But the assignment and sublease language is super important, and we like to get that out of the way to some extent in the LOI. We know that when we see it in the lease, there's going to be a lot more words attached to it, and some of them are legal words that we don't even know what it means a lot of times. So we haven't talked about that yet, but we also really want to see people have a restaurant real estate attorney negotiating the legal terms of their lease for them.
And that's a very good point, because that is next on the list, is that everything Emily's walked us through can really help us better prepare ourselves or better prepare, say, clients. But brokers don't do the legal work, just like attorneys don't go out and find the locations. You need them both. So at what point, Emily, do you recommend that your clients, seek a real estate attorney?
Well, for sure, when we get a lease.
For sure.
And then we need to make sure that the attorney has our LOI and has some insight into and about the building and the property and the shopping center. And the latest point would be after we have received a first draft of the lease.
Okay.
We need an attorney at the LOI process. However, we're just working on a deal right now where they had some language in our LOI that was pretty legal and a little bit more technical. So we did bring the attorney in at the LOI stage there.
Okay, so make a note of that. And this attorney that we're bringing in, going back to the very first thing that I heard Emily say about how good it is to use people who specialize in things. So the right attorney for this isn't your friend that you know from church, or the person that negotiated, I don't know, some of your maybe family affairs, or the right attorney for this isn't the person that wrote up your will. There are real estate attorneys. This is what they do. And I would definitely recommend that you listen to your broker and maybe use a real estate attorney they suggest, or certainly bring a real estate attorney to them when they say that it's time.
Absolutely, very important. A lot of times, unfortunately, when we get a lease from a landlord, it is very much more in favor of the landlord than it is the tenant. And that's just the reality.
Well, we're just about out of time, but I always like to save about 5 minutes towards the end to make sure that if there are particular points that we made that you'd like revisited, we have time to do so. Or if there's a particular question, if a restaurant guy's out there and you've got a particular deal you're working, and you want us to address a particular question, now's the time. Just type us in a note and we'll do it. Emily, why don't you give us a little overview of something exciting that's happening? I mean, any national group moving into Dallas that they don't already have, or is there anything, any new project or something that's happening in Texas that is going to be great because they, I don't know, some new multi-development that a lot of startups are going to want to go after?
Yeah, well, first, some of the projects that have already happened in Dallas, like the one in the Colony, they're just the number of transactions and the level of interest in some of these projects is just crazy. It's just a healthy state for our business. There are lots of national tenants that are coming to Texas. We just started working with a new one yesterday called Mason's Famous Lobster Roll from the Northeast, and they'll be coming to Dallas and they'll be coming to Houston. We work with chains like Pokeworks, and they're looking for more locations in Dallas. So you're really just going to start to see everybody in Texas. It is a very sought after market. There's another group doing deals right now called Fat Burger. This is I believe, California chain that's about to do several locations in Dallas. It's just the business environment is just a little bit friendlier here. So we're seeing all kinds of great things coming our way.
And are we going to see more of these developments where people are trying to do the whole multi-market development, where it's a mid-rise building that has maybe offices or apartments, but there's retail and restaurants on the bottom, and it's, you know, facing a park that also has then shopping. So we've got shopping and living and offices and eating all in one place. Is that working?
Well, you know, the question of whether or not it's working is a very different question than are we going to see this. As the price of land continues to increase throughout Texas, we are only going to see buildings, we call it going vertical, because it just doesn't work for the developers to do a one-story building in a lot of places. So we're going to see it. And I think the more that we see it, the more people will accept it as normal and how you shop and do business. There's no question there's going to be a lot more of that.
Well, I'm checking again, and let's see. Looks like we may have hit all the topics. So I'm just going to do a real quick summary for those of you who maybe cooked in a little late. We've been picking the brain of Emily Durham because she is my go-to real estate knowledgeable expert. She and the group that she works with are able to help restaurants throughout the state, actually placement throughout the nation. And so if any of you advisors want to visit and learn a little bit more, you can contact Emily. Would you want to just tell everyone your particular email address and how people can follow up with you more directly?
Sure. And if you don't catch it exactly, I work for JLL. You can find me on the JLL website, but my email address is emily.durham, which is DURHAM @am.jll.com.
And we've just kind of taken a little thumb sketch of the process of A to Z, and each one of those 9 or 10 steps can create some speed bumps that are unique that you have to get over. So if you remember 1 or 2 things only, please remember that whether it's your first restaurant or your 30th restaurant, don't go too far along without consulting a broker that specializes in restaurants.